There was a moment when Queen stood together on stage, four legends sharing the spotlight. Yet they were no longer the same band. Freddie Mercury had already begun slipping away, pulled into a world none of the others could reach. And what happened next nearly ended Queen forever. The rise that made the fall inevitable. To understand how Queen reached that breaking point, you have to look back to their peak, the mid to late 1970s, when the band wasn't just famous, they were unstoppable. Albums like A Night at the Opera and A Day at the Races didn't just sell, they defined an era. Bohemian Rhapsody rewrote the rules of what rock music could be. Stadiums weren't just filled, they were conquered. But success doesn't just elevate a band, it weighs on them. Queen toured relentlessly, for years at a time. Hotel rooms blurred together, nights bled into mornings. Interviews, rehearsals, flights, performances, press. Thousands of voices chanting your name, yet not a single space to breathe. Fame looked glamorous on the outside, but on the inside, it squeezed everything tighter and tighter. And Freddie was a man who lived at full volume. On stage, he was invincible, a comet blazing across the sky. Off stage, he was searching for identity, searching for expressions, searching for a life that matched the intensity of the world he created under the spotlight. Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon, they each coped differently. Brian dove deeper into the music. Roger tried to keep the band grounded in rock. John kept to himself. But Freddie wanted more experiences, more transformation, more freedom than the structure of a band, even one as bold as Queen, could give him at that time. Creative tension began to form, invisible at first, subtle differences in vision, small disagreements in the studio, a shift in energy during rehearsals. Freddie started writing differently, leaning into rhythm, into movement, into sound that could pulse through the floor of a club at 2 a.m. He wanted the music to feel alive, physical, untamed. The others didn't see where he was going yet, not because they lacked vision, but because their visions were no longer perfectly aligned. And pressure. Pressure has a way of turning cracks into fractures. But the storm wasn't coming from the music alone. It was coming from someone new who stepped into Freddie's world, the influence of Prenter. The shift truly began when a new figure entered Freddie's inner circle. Prenter. He was charismatic, confident, and understood the nightlife world that Freddie was starting to crave. Prenter wasn't just a friend, he became a gatekeeper, someone who could open doors to the clubs, the parties, the after-hours scenes that promised freedom from being Freddie Mercury of Queen. At first, the band didn't think much of him. Everyone around Freddie came and went in waves, but Paul was different. He had influence. And slowly, that influence began to shape Freddie's priorities. Paul encouraged Freddie to step away from the routine of band life, the writing sessions, studio planning, the rehearsals that had always been their foundation. He told Freddie he didn't need those things, that he was bigger than the band, that Queen held him back, toned him down, and kept him tied to the past. And Freddie listened. Studio days became studio hours. Rehearsals began late. Sometimes they didn't happen at all. Freddie started living more at night than during the day. The clubs of London and Munich became the real stage, a world of lights, smoke, music, and anonymity, where he could be anyone, do anything, feel everything. Brian and Roger began noticing the distance first. Brian tried to reach out, to understand what Freddie was searching for, but every attempt felt like interference. Roger reacted with frustration, pushing back with sharp words that only drove Freddie further into the circle Paul controlled. John stayed quiet, but that silence said enough. Something was shifting, and not in their favor, and there was music. Freddie's new world demanded a new sound, something physical, pulsing, alive with rhythm. He wanted to explore funk, dance, club beats, sounds that made bodies move, not just audiences listen. When he brought those ideas to the band, the room didn't ignite, it froze. Brian, rooted in layered guitar harmonies, felt pushed aside. Roger, always the rock heartbeat, felt the rhythm shifting away from him. The band wasn't just evolving, it was being redefined. What had once been four minds moving as one was becoming four directions, no longer aligned. But the real breaking point wasn't the music, it was what that new sound would become next. And that moment arrived when the band began working on one of their most controversial albums, the album that nearly shattered everything. The Hot Space era, the breaking point. When Queen started working on what would become Hot Space, the divide that had been quietly spreading finally rose to the surface. This was no small shift in style. It was a full departure from the massive operatic rock sound the world associated with Queen. Freddie pushed for something entirely different, a pulsing, sweaty, club-driven album that echoed the nightlife scene he was living in. And for him, it wasn't just music, it was an identity. He wanted songs that lived under neon lights, not stadium spotlights. Songs that felt like the late-night rooms where everyone was anonymous and everything felt possible. To Freddie, this was evolution, necessary, thrilling, electric. But to Brian and Roger, it felt like erasing the very heartbeat of Queen. In the studio, disagreements weren't just disagreements, they were collisions. Freddie wanted to strip back guitar layers. Brian wanted to protect the band's sonic core. Roger wanted rhythm, but not this rhythm. And John, caught in the middle, followed whichever side felt least destructive that day. The sessions turned tense. The laughter that once filled recording rooms went silent. The band used to communicate through instinct. One look, one chord, one smile, and the music formed like magic. Now, it felt like four musicians trapped in the same room, each one holding a different map of where they should go. When Hot Space was released, critics didn't hold back. Fans didn't either. The reaction hit harder than any argument inside the studio ever could. People didn't just dislike the album, some felt betrayed by it. And beneath the reviews, beneath the noise, something else was happening. Freddie didn't retreat. He doubled down. Instead of pulling the band together, the backlash pushed him further into the world. Paul Prenter promised him. The world of late nights, loud rooms, strangers who adored the idea of Freddie Mercury rather than the man behind the voice. For Brian and Roger, it felt like watching their friend disappear in real time, like sand slipping through their fingers no matter how hard they tried to hold on. But the real fracture wasn't musical, it was personal. Because soon, Freddie wouldn't just drift creatively. He began drifting emotionally, away from the band, away from the people who truly knew him, away from the life they had all built together. And that's when Queen realized they were losing him. Freddie pulls away. The distance they could feel but couldn't stop. As the 1980s began, Queen was no longer moving as one. The music wasn't the only thing changing. Freddie was. The man who once laughed the loudest in the studio now seemed distant, harder to recognize, harder to reach. He started spending more nights in the clubs of Munich and London, rooms filled with booming bass, flashing lights, and people who didn't care about Freddie Mercury, the frontman of Queen. They cared about the energy he brought into the room, the fearlessness, the danger. To them, he wasn't part of a band. He was a world unto himself. And that was exactly what pulled him deeper. Where the band saw routine and responsibility, Freddie saw confinement. Touring schedules felt like cages. Interviews felt like scripts. The music they had once made together felt like something he had already lived, already done. Paul Prenter made sure those feelings had space to grow. He didn't just open the doors to nightlife, he closed doors behind Freddie. Slowly, subtly, the band found themselves losing access to him. Phone calls went unanswered. Rehearsal times shifted or were canceled. Ideas that once sparked excitement now sparked arguments, defensiveness, silence. It wasn't hostility. It was absent. Brian and Roger weren't angry. Not at first. They were hurt. Because they remembered Freddie who wrote songs with them shoulder to shoulder, laughing between takes, dreaming out loud about the future of Queen. That Freddie felt gone. John Deacon, quiet by nature, said even less now. But the concern sat heavy in his eyes every time Freddie walked into the studio, late, or didn't show up at all. Rumors stirred within the industry. Freddie was considering going solo. And the painful part wasn't that people believed it, it was that the band did. There were moments where Freddie seemed unreachable, like he was chasing something none of them could see, a feeling, a self, an identity that didn't exist inside Queen. And when someone searches for themselves with that kind of hunger, nothing else can truly compete. The band continued performing, recording, moving forward. But underneath it all was a quiet grief. They weren't losing a singer, they were losing a brother. And then it happened. The moment everything cracked open in the middle of a session, the band would never forget. Because what Freddie said next changed Queen forever. The day they almost lost him for good. The breaking point didn't arrive in some grand cinematic moment. It came on an ordinary studio day, the kind they'd lived through hundreds of times. The band was working, or at least trying to. The energy in the room was already strained. Brian was adjusting guitar arrangements. Roger was restless, tapping out rhythms that nobody was acknowledging. John sat in his usual quiet steadiness, waiting for the music to become a place he could enter. Freddie walked in late, wearing sunglasses indoors, voice rough from the previous night. He didn't offer excuses, didn't explain, didn't even try to smooth the tension. He simply sat down and listened to the playback of a track they had been shaping together. Except it didn't feel together at all. Brian tried to open the conversation, to suggest a new direction for the chorus. Roger pushed for tightening the drums. They weren't arguing yet. They were trying, still trying. But Freddie didn't respond. Not to the music, not to the room, not to them. And then, almost casually, almost like it meant nothing, he said it. "I think I'm going to do my own thing for a while." Silence. Total, absolute silence. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't dramatic. He was calm, too calm. Brian stared at him, searching for the joke, the irony, the theatrical flourish that usually softened Freddie's bluntness. There was none. Roger's jaw tightened, anger mixing with heartbreak in equal measure. John's eyes fell to the floor, because he already knew this moment had been coming. They had heard rumors. They had feared this. But hearing it from Freddie himself was something entirely different. Freddie had always been Queen's spark, the fire at the center, the fuel, the spirit. Without him, they weren't a band. They were four men who used to create magic. And what hurt most wasn't the idea of Freddie exploring something new. It was the feeling that he was leaving them behind. Brotherhood wasn't built in record sales or applause. It was built in the quiet things. Late-night writing sessions, shared exhaustion, inside jokes on tour buses. The understanding that no matter how intense the world became, they had each other. Now that bond was breaking. Not with screaming, not with betrayal, but with distance, with emptiness. The band didn't fight him. They just let the moment fall over them. Because sometimes heartbreak is too big for words. And Freddie walked out of that session believing he was ready to step into a world without Queen. But the world had one moment, one unimaginable stage, waiting to pull them back together. Live Aid, the moment that saved everything. Freddie did leave. He went into the world Paul Prenter had led him toward. The late nights, the loud music, the endless parade of strangers and sensations that promised freedom. And for a while, it felt like freedom. Solo projects were planned, written, recorded, money flowed, the spotlight still followed him. But something was missing, something he didn't notice at first. When Freddie sang alone, the stage was still large, the lights were still bright, the audience was still roaring, but the energy was different. With Queen, the music didn't just come from instruments, it came from connection. Four forces crashing into each other to create something bigger than any one of them could ever be alone. Without that, even applause could feel empty. Meanwhile, the band continued, not together, but parallel. They worked, they recorded, but everyone felt it. The spark wasn't there. The fire was gone. And then came Live Aid, July 13th, 1985. One concert, one stage, one broadcast reached nearly 2 billion people. Every major artist in the world was performing. The stakes were enormous. But Queen wasn't the powerhouse they once were. Not anymore. When the band met to rehearse for the show, something unexpected happened. They didn't argue. They didn't force anything. They didn't talk about the past. They just played. For the first time in years, the music felt like it used to. No control, no ego, no tension, just pure creation. And Freddie, who had been drifting, searching, spiraling, remembered something. This was home. So, when Queen walked onto that stage at Wembley Stadium, the world didn't know what was about to happen. The band didn't just perform, they detonated. Freddie owned that stage like no one else in history. His voice soared. His presence was colossal. Every note, every gesture, every breath was electric. The crowd didn't just watch, they responded. They answered him. They became part of the performance. It wasn't a concert, it was resurrection. And in the middle of it, Freddie realized something with absolute clarity. He didn't belong anywhere else. Not in the clubs, not in the parties, not in the chaos of someone else's world. He belonged here, with them, with Queen. After Live Aid, the rumors stopped. The distance faded. They worked again, not out of habit, but out of love. They had almost lost each other, and the world had almost lost them. But something rare had happened. They got a second chance. Queen came closer to breaking than the world ever knew. But in that one moment, under the lights of Live Aid, they remembered something bigger than fame, pressure, or pride. They were never just a band. They were a bond. And sometimes, almost losing everything is what reminds you why it mattered in the first place. If you want more hidden stories behind the legends, hit subscribe. This is Backstage Melody, where the music lives on.